So, as a few more folks get here, welcome to the How Good Online Innovation Series. We're focusing on biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and planetary health. Today, we're doing one of the thought leader conversations. That's one of 3 layers or levels of detail that we go into in this series. And today's thought leader conversation will be with Steve Rosenzweig and Jay Watson from General Mills, working different angles of bringing regeneration to life across a large and complex global supply system. Here's a little overview of the structure for today. After this intro, we'll dive into a conversation, which will be about 30-35 minutes. We'll do some interactive community breakouts. We get a chance to meet with other folks who are here and interested and hear what they're doing, and then also develop some specific questions for Jay and Steve. And then we'll come back together for the last 15 minutes or so to do Q&A. And so you can actually write your questions down, where you can put them in the chat. We probably won't see them till about that 30-35 minute mark. And you can also just raise your hand and come off mute and ask them once we get to that Q&A session. Last thing I'll say is that we've got a couple excellent upcoming events. One is Regenerative Packaging. That's with Jane French from Noumi Organic Teas, who's done some pretty incredible work towards thinking about what does regenerative packaging even mean, some really interesting compostable solutions, and just really looking at the future of packaging there. And then we'll look at how do you develop a regenerative food product from the beginning, from the start, not having to improve a legacy product that has some challenges, but really just starting from regenerative agriculture at the beginning. And that'll be with Jesse Smith and Lauren Tucker from the White Buffalo Land Trust. Also just mention that after this series wraps up, we're going to be doing another one focusing on Black, Indigenous, and people of color farming and the intersection of that with regenerative agriculture and biodiversity. So that's sort of the fall series that's going to be coming up. We'd love to have you all there as well. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'll stop sharing screen and welcome Jay and Steve. Part of the title of this talk is focusing on outcomes and not just on practices. And that's something really important that I focus a lot on in regenerative agriculture. What actually happens, what actually changes instead of just what you do. So I don't know, as you introduce yourselves briefly, maybe you could talk a bit about why you care about outcomes. Why are you focusing on that as opposed to just practices? Jay first, then Steve.
Okay, yeah, hi, good afternoon or good evening, whoever's joining. Jay Watson here. I work on our global sustainability team at General Mills. I've been with the organization for 14 years, just celebrated 14 years last week. My background's in sourcing, so I spent 10 years as a buyer of ingredients, packaging, commodities, services for General Mills before joining the sustainability team, and I have accountability for most of our sourcing sustainability efforts, which, as you can imagine, focuses a lot on agriculture. So lead a lot of our soil health and regenerative ag efforts with the broader team, Steve included. And some of those efforts, I'd say, before regenerative ag, we're already focused on outcomes. If we think about our 2020 sourcing commitment, and we're trying to model outcomes when we're maybe don't have the technology or the funds or the resources to be able to kind of take measurements. So a lot of our work has always been focused on outcomes because it's the so what, right? Like we can understand what practices are changing. We want to understand impact. I think personally, I think it has a much stronger narrative where we've talked about change versus change on like the landscape and change in outcomes we care about, like water and soil health, biodiversity, profitability, and not just about compliance or meeting a checklist of practices. And so that's been a focus of General Mills for quite some time now in our sustainability efforts. But I'll transition it over to Steve, who can talk about how we're bringing some of the outcomes to life with actual measurements.
Yeah, I'm Steve Rosenzweig. I'm a soil scientist at General Mills. I've been with the company for about 2.5 years. Prior to coming to General Mills, I did my PhD in soil and crop sciences at Colorado State. And I'm part of a longer term research division at General Mills. So I have kind of the luxury to think about how we have a long-term strategy and think about this 10-year commitment that we have to regenerative agriculture, and help develop technologies and ways that we can measure outcomes long term. And part of the reason why we focus on, why we don't focus on practices specifically is because there's, no one practice produces a regenerative effect in every context. And there's hundreds of different kinds of practices that you can implement to achieve the same effect. And so we really focus, instead of on practices, on principles, general concepts that, each consist of hundreds of different kinds of practices that can implement or get to that principle. So that's why we focus on principles and outcomes, because it's much more flexible to a farmer's unique context. And so, yeah, I mean, we're focused on 4 outcomes: soil health, biodiversity, water, and that could be water quality or quantity or both, depending on the context, and farmer economic resilience. And so part of my role is to figure out how we measure those things at scale. And so it's a lot of work. There's improvements in sensors and models, and just the approach, the way we work with farmers to measure these outcomes, that is constantly evolving. And so we have a bit of a roadmap for each of those outcomes and how we're currently doing it, which is really expensive and time consuming, and how we're planning to do it in the future, which is a much more scaled and streamlined way of monitoring changes in those 4 outcomes in our key sourcing regions.
And what are some of those key sourcing regions, and what are some of the crops, just so we have a bit of a sense of it?
Yeah, sure. So, if you think about General Mills, there's brands like Cheerios and Nature Valley that heavily leverage oats as the key ingredient. And so oats are mostly grown in the northern plains, including North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Canadian provinces. There's brands like Pillsbury and Gold Medal Flour that use wheat. And so we're working a lot on wheat in states like Kansas and Oklahoma and Colorado. General Mills also has dairy, so Yoplait, for example, that, there's a lot of different dairies around the country that source to that, but, we're working mostly in Michigan on the dairy commitment as well.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I think sometimes when we talk about our work publicly, we do focus on an ingredient, but I think our approach is to really look at the whole system, right? To focus on the place, the potential of that place and the producer, because we know that oats sits within a rotation. We know that wheat does as well. And so how are we investing in the land, in the system, and not just only in the oat producing years or the wheat producing years?
Right. So it sounds like overall, some of what I'm hearing about your approach is you're not just showing up to a farmer and saying, hey, here's a checklist of practices that we've approved as best management practices, and we want you to start doing them. It sounds like it's a little bit, or even a lot more nuanced, or just a totally different approach than that, towards understanding their whole rotation, their whole geographic, climatic context. How does that work? How are you bringing that to life? What are some things that you've accomplished in some of these supply systems, moving from that, as opposed to, did you check all the boxes and do these practices?
Yeah, so we have a pilot, we have pilot strategy. So we really just kicked off this commitment last year, and we've been setting up pilot programs, pilot approaches for how we actually engage with farmers in these sourcing regions to help them transition or implement these regenerative systems.
Sorry, what's the commitment?
Oh, so we've committed to advance regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres by 2030. And so really starting with those key sourcing regions, Northern Plains, Southern Plains, Great Lakes states, and figuring out how does a food company engage with farmers on the ground, many of whom we don't have a direct contracting relationship with, to help them implement these regenerative systems. And so, our approach to date that we've been piloting really focuses on, first, education. And so we've partnered with the Soil Health Academy. They put on 2- and 3-day workshops, really to try to, instill that regenerative mindset. I mean, we acknowledge that it's really a different way of thinking and a different paradigm for a lot of farmers. And we sort of have to deprogram that conventional mindset and everything that they're bringing to the table, and to kind of reprogram or give a solid foundation in regenerative principles, so that, just to kick off the program. And then
do farmers want, I mean, can they tell there's something different about what you're doing? Do they want that? Do they just say, can't you just give me the fertilizer, Rex? Like what's it like on the ground working with some of the farmers in the system?
I think that's a great question, because the approach that we've taken is that so I'd say yes, some farmers want it. There's plenty of farmers who don't show up to the soil health academies, who aren't engaging with General Mills, and those are the ones that I think we'll eventually need to get after. But we're kind of oversampling these early innovators, given that there's a demand for some of the pilots and programs that we're kicking off. There definitely is that, well, okay, if I'm not supposed to do what I'm doing now, then tell me what it is that I'm supposed to do. And that's where I think our approach to mindset and resources for farmers so that they can evolve their mindset and approach shows up in the way that we partner with organizations like Steve mentioned. And it really is about pairing them with these technical resources, many of them farmers themselves who have gone down the path already, to serve as a resource to that farmer to help them identify the right things for their farm, not tell them what to do. So it really is a lot of coaching is maybe not the best word, but it's, okay, based on what you learned in the Soil Health Academy, what might you think about doing? And then the technical assistance, the one-on-one coach is there to help kind of like steer that with the producer if it's getting really off track. But it's the producer's decision to figure out what they want to do based on their unique understanding of their system. And it's, again, with the foundation of these principles that might be applied differently on their farm versus someone else's. So we some of those early learnings are producers that are just like, well, I'm not getting a whole lot of value from my coach because they're not giving me the prescription. And we just have to remind them that's like, well, that's not the idea. That's not how we've designed the program. And I think some have gotten past that now to say, okay, this is really, I have to do the work. I have resources to help me kind of evolve in my approach, but I'm the one who's going to understand best what to do on my unique operation.
Awesome. Fascinating. So sorry, maybe back to you, Steve. What do you feel like, what have you accomplished so far? What's moving? Where do you see things going in some of these systems?
Yeah, I mean, even just going back to the first question, like there are tons of farmers looking for this type of information. These soil health academies are extremely well attended, and most often they fill up before everybody can get in. And so farmers are really hungry for this information. They do see, a lot of them have their backs against the wall economically, and they're looking for a different way. And so I think, that's encouraging, is that, there is a lot of interest in this space. We don't have to twist people's arms to come to a workshop. But, I'd also say even among the early innovators, like Jay mentioned, it's going to be a long journey. We're providing one-on-one coaching for 3 years, because it's going to have to be a process that evolves. There's so much ingrained, perceptions and assumptions about agriculture that farmers carry with them, that, it's just going to take time to overcome that, even among the set that already have an open mind. So I think that's just been an early challenge, but also an opportunity, I think, and a signal that I think we're on the right track with this one-on-one coaching type model. So that's been encouraging.
Yeah, it sounds like, really unlocking the peer-to-peer learning and focusing on that for the farmers. I know as a farmer myself, and with other farmers that I've worked with, I don't want anybody coming and telling me what to do, but I love talking to my peers and learning what they're doing, and sort of growing and improving that way. All of this seems like you're saying, it's an investment. It's going to take time. Do you think this actually makes business sense for General Mills as a company for the short term, mid-term, long term?
Yeah, I definitely think it does. It's just like it's good for the planet, good for producers. I think it's good for business as well. We talk a lot about supply chain resiliency when we have ecosystems that aren't functioning and we are sourcing ingredients from those ecosystems. There could be significant disruption with market shocks, weather shocks, and so investing in our sourcing regions for greater ecosystem, but then supply chain resilience is a good thing for our supply chain, and that's why we have really strong supporters in our executive management team, because I think they understand that. Certainly, the opportunity is to go well beyond just kind of like risk mitigation to creating differential value for customers, for consumers. And that's where, you know, there's more work in the last few years to figure out how we talk about the work that we're doing, how we elevate the stories of these farmers to talk about really them as being the climate heroes or the key change agents to bring about cleaner water or, you know, better ecosystem health, because that's not really well understood. And so I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg, I think, to unlocking a lot more value for our organization and for the broader system. But it's like Steve said, it's going to take some time. But I think we're committed. And the nice thing is we have a 10-year commitment to give us kind of that cover to work long-term, like Steve talked about.
In terms of some of these outcomes you had mentioned, soil, water, biodiversity, you know, for a long time, companies and organizations have been working to reduce harm to like get to quote unquote sustainable or a net zero on these. Is it actually possible to go beyond that? Can you get to the point on farms in the system where you are, you know, sequestering carbon, where somehow biodiversity is increasing? Do you see early signs of that happening? Yeah, is it possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, there's so many instances in, you know, both anecdotal reports that we see among farmers today, but also just in the scientific literature that it's totally possible to regenerate soil health, regenerate biodiversity, have a more profitable and resilient business, you know, provide cleaner water. There's just thousands of examples of that in the scientific literature. So we know it's possible. And, you know, we see it today. There's lots of farmers who are doing it. You know, part of the challenge is just figuring out how we actually measure the total impact that all of these different farmers are having in a region like this. You know, there's not enough grad students in the world to go out and take soil samples across millions of acres. And so part of the challenge is figuring out how we advance technology, how we advance our approach to actually monitoring these systems. But it is possible. And that's really the primary reason why farmers are doing it is they recognize this system isn't functioning as well as it could. I need to make it better. And once they start seeing signs of improvement, then they're hooked. And that, you know, that's kind of what kicks off the rest of their journey is actually seeing measurable improvements or observable improvements that they see themselves.
Yeah.
So it's
maybe not all that surprising, but leading with climate doesn't resonate with all producers. Probably resonates with a small subset. And so I think that's one of the early learnings, and not just from our work in regenerative agriculture, but before that with some of our sustainability efforts, just like understanding how to show up a little bit better and to carry a message from General Mills and what we can do and how we can play a small role in this overall movement. And understanding that we need to bring kind of a very holistic value proposition that will resonate with the producer wherever they are. If they care about climate, great, we can talk about climate. If they care about water, we can talk about water, and there's a focus there. If it's about their grandchildren, then let's talk about profitability and resiliency. And so it really is making sure that we understand some of that local context and to the extent possible, some of the uniqueness, so we can use the right language to maintain that strong engagement with producers so that they understand that we are really invested in the area, and it's not just about our climate commitment and reducing emissions so that we can talk about net zero, whatever it may be. It really is about all these cascading compounding benefits and positive impacts that we see in regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I remember reading a paper, I think it was last year, that looked at a number of different practices. I think it was focused on regen ag in corn. And one of the amazing outcomes of it was, even though there was some variation in yield, the profitability of the farmers increased significantly, you know, by 75% or something like that, really significantly. And so this sort of combination of shifting the practices, but in the way you're talking about them, it's shifting practices uniquely to each individual farmer. Just like you were saying, you know, how you connect with them, whether on climate or, you know, my grandchildren, is going to be different. Then the practices end up being different, but overall, the whole thing ends up heading towards, you know, positive financial bottom line for them, and then on the ecosystem and carbon side as well. Do you think it'll speed up? Right, you've got pilots in Kansas on wheat. You've got pilots on oats. There's some pilots happening in dairy. yeah, do you think it's going to pick up from there and expand to all the ingredients in the supply system, or will the relatively smaller number of farmers that are in there, are they going to go out and do the spreading beyond themselves, or will you have to expand the pilots? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab and then let Steve provide his comments. But I mean, I think given again that we're taking more of a place-based approach, focusing on a broad region, I think we are creating this opportunity to kind of pitch a very large tent that many others can come under. Because we might not care about as much about all those ingredients in the rotation if we don't. We know that they're part of the system, but we may not have an interest in sourcing those. And so if someone sources a rotational crop that's maybe not to the point of investing in regenerative ag yet, they have the opportunities to then later come in and participate in the collaborative. So I think it invites kind of a different level of partnership and collaboration with our approach and focusing on regions versus specific supply chains. I think we definitely are looking, I feel like Steve and I, that's what we do a lot, is just like, where are the next places, where might we have some of those partnership opportunities, where might there already be a really strong like ground game of support locally that we can come in and help like amplify or accelerate. We're going to be looking to expand our pilot opportunities, but I also think like within our peer set and the broader industry, there's certainly been a lot more talk about regenerative agriculture in the last few years. And so I think there's a lot of questions like, what does it mean? What can we do to align efforts, approaches, measurements? And that's where I'm really excited to think about that some sort of consistency maybe is not the right word, but like if we're all concerned about some of the same resources, then how can we pool resources to advance science, to advance technology? It's going to be really difficult and take a lot longer if it's only General Mills and a subset of other companies doing that versus everyone who's buying a commodity or ingredient for a particular region, helping to advance the overall effort. So that's kind of what I'm excited for, but tough sledding ahead for sure. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, part of the theory of change is a bit like, we're early on in this movement, I think. There's, maybe we're at 10% or less, 5% of farmers that have really implemented these regenerative systems. And so kind of the theory of, adoption diffusion is like, you need a lot of information about how something works before it spreads. And really the idea with these pilots is we're going to help the farmers that are really interested in moving down this path accelerate the learnings about what works and what doesn't work. Let's generate the know-how for how to implement regenerative ag in all these different contexts. And so let's just speed up that early phase of generating all this information. And then the next stage is really to help translate that information to the next wave of adopters. And so, that's going to look different depending on where we're at. And so really we have to think about what phase 2 of all these pilots looks like in each of these regions. That's going to be different based on our partner set, based on the constraints and opportunities for all those places. But that's really, I think, where we have to go next is how do we make this much beyond just those pilot farmers that we've engaged and helped, figure these systems out. And I do think a lot of it is going to be them, enabling them as mentors and, leaders in their communities to help spread that information. How can we support them and build their mentorship capacity so that when their neighbors are asking them, how are you doing this stuff? They have the ability to translate that to them and kind of inspire the community to move along with them.
Yeah, the scaled approach needs to be like a locally led approach. And so figuring out how to invest in the local capacity and capability so that we can eventually exit to the extent that we're investing now, having done some of the early lifting, but then really letting the local experts, including farmers, then build more of a sustainable regenerating model to ensure that it keeps moving forward. And
I really love the image you're both putting forward about concentrating on a place, not like, oh, we're just doing wheat or we're just doing oats, but saying what are all the other crops, even beyond the single crop rotation, but what's happening in that place. And then maybe we're working pre-competitively with other businesses, with other organizations that work in that same place in order to advance and sort of grow the outcomes over a longer term. And I think we're starting to see more of that in the industry. I'm certainly trying to invite and push it along as much as possible. And at the same time, like you said, there has been excitement in the larger community about regenerative agriculture, about the possibilities. But that excitement recently, at least, has also brought some pushback There's been some articles that have been a bit critical of regenerative agriculture. And yeah, I'm just curious how you have heard them, maybe you could tell us a bit, what are some of those kind of critiques that have come towards regen ag, and then how you're thinking about, like, okay, how do we reconcile those? What can we do with that in order to grow what we're doing?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. Like any movement, there's a whole diversity of perspectives and personalities represented. And it's hard not to take it personally when regenerative ag is attacked, but there's a lot of different versions of regenerative ag that are out there. And I think what we're trying to do at General Mills is to be as clear as possible about what we believe regenerative ag is. And we're in the process of actually updating our definition right now. Being clear about what it is and what it can do. And so, we're trying to root that as much as possible in the way farmers and ranchers are using the term, and also what we know is achievable based on scientific realities. And so, as an example, regenerative ag is not going to reverse climate change. We can't take out all of the carbon we've ever emitted and we're still emitting. We still have to focus on stopping emissions. But when you look at the opportunities to fight and adapt to climate change, increase biodiversity, improve water, improve farmer economic resilience, regenerative ag, we believe, is by far the most promising strategy. And so we have to really talk about regenerative ag in terms of what it can do, and why we believe so strongly that it's such an important thing to focus on. And it might be different for us from other people, but we're just trying to be as clear and vocal as possible about what we think it is.
Yeah, I think, of course, we're biased, but some of the arguments against regenerative ag we think are pretty severely flawed. I mean, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but I think in a lot of cases it's like, well, regenerative ag is all about carbon, which we just don't believe, we don't feel the same way. It's about all these positive impacts and not just on climate. It's about this whole ecosystem, including the people and the stewards of the land in the ecosystem. And so unless those sharing their opinions have a similar view of like all these positive outcomes and impacts of regenerative ag, it's easy to focus on one thing and look at it through a narrow lens and say, well, it's maybe not everything we think it to be. Well, they're not really even looking at the whole system and opportunity. And a good example of that is like, well, if you're less productive on a piece of land because you're not getting the same type of yield, you're going to have to go and expand and go clear more land to feed the same amount of people or a growing population. But if you're not thinking about regenerative ag and restoring ecosystems and specifically nutrient cycling, then you probably don't have this idea that, well, you could maybe be as productive, if not more productive. And if you have changed the mindset of that producer, do you think a regenerative producer is going to go and try and clear land to produce more food? Or do you think they're going to try to be as efficient as possible with the land that they have while also making more money? So I think it's just, there's differing point of views on what regenerative agriculture is and how holistic it is. And that's where there's some debate.
Yeah, I think there's been some thought that sort of like regenerative ag has been painted as a panacea, that it's like the silver bullet that solves everything. And I think what I hear from both of you is, no, like we still have to be doing reduction. We have to make sure we're not supporting deforestation in different crops where that happens, and in the places where where agriculture is the best fit, we need to be moving that towards regeneration as part of a larger overall approach.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at our greenhouse gas footprint, our entire footprint from farm to fork to landfill, over half of that is in agriculture. And so, the question then is, how do you reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture, for example? And it's not long before you get to, let's sequester carbon and, rely more on the natural fertility in the soil and less on, inputs. And so that's slowly how I think we have arrived at it. That was our way in, I think, to regenerative ag. But then once we got there, we really saw it actually does all these things. It supports all of these pillars of sustainability that we care about, including farmers and ranchers. So climate was our way in, but it's definitely not the only door, that leads to regenerative ag.
Yeah, and that on-ramp is important, right? Because not all producers are going to be ready to say, I want to only do more good on my land. Some might only be ready to say like, okay, how do I just be more efficient with fertilizer? But that might be the gateway to soil health and nutrient cycling. They just need to get better and not apply fertilizer in the fall if they're not, you're not going to plant a crop until the spring. So like understanding that we also have to build some of those on-ramps as part of an and strategy helps it be less of a panacea where it's like regenerative ag, regenerative ag, regenerative ag. Regenerative ag is part of a total system to driving the whole agriculture industry forward.
Awesome. I have a couple of kind of question directions I want to go. Also, we're starting to get questions in the chat, which is great. If you have questions emerging, you can put them in there and we'll pick them up after the little the breakouts. But maybe just talk a bit about what some of the like science, some of the technology you see on the horizon that you think will, you know, do some of what you're talking about, speed up the measurements, speed up the tracking, help things, you know, go from kind of the phase one researching, information gathering and the pilots into the larger expansion in phase two. Yeah, what are you seeing out there on the horizon that we should all, you know, as folks in the industry paying attention to this, that we should be keeping an eye on as well?
Yeah, you know, we could talk about like better sensors, better models, better ways of quantifying outcomes. But I think, you know, one of the most transformational opportunities is just a different mindset within science itself. You know, so much research that's been done to date has really looked at the impact of changing one thing, because that's so much easier to study. Is like, what if we just reduce tillage and let's see what happens there. But farmers that are going down this regenerative path are changing a lot of things in a systems approach. And so we need a scientific approach that can match that. And so that's really what we're trying to bring alongside of all of our programs is like, let's bring a scientific approach that helps us quantify, that enables us to quantify these emergent benefits of these whole systems. And so it'll make it challenging to say, when this farmer did this, it produced this effect. But it will enable us to say, like, when a farmer has a different mindset and is approaching this system differently, these benefits are able to emerge, and we can quantify, you know, how long is it taking for farmers to become more profitable? You know, how quickly can soil regenerate? And does it always regenerate, or like what are the things that kind of contribute to that? What types of insects and bird species are impacted by in-field agricultural management as opposed to surrounding habitat? You know, a lot of these questions that are more based on like, you know, what's actually happening on farms, we can address just by working with farmers and doing science in the context of their reality. And so, you know, we have just teams of ecologists and entomologists and soil scientists going out and studying these fields today and trying to get to the heart of like, you know, what changes do we see in insects and the services that they provide farmers when a farmer moves down this regenerative path. And that will help us to understand the links between things like insect diversity and ecosystem services, like the functional you know, the functions that these insects provide. And similarly for birds, we're trying to figure out, you know, what birds are living in and around these farms. How are they using the farm as opposed to the surrounding habitat? And what birds might be indicators of overall ecosystem health? And what are those links that we can look towards, you know, in the future? And so we're just early on in that research journey today, but we're hoping to, you know, to have some of these indicators that relate to much more about the ecosystem function that we can monitor well into the future.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, you're talking about, I asked you a question about tech and you said the tech that needs to change is basically the tech of our mind and even how we look at it and do research. So it's cool that what you all have been talking about the shift of paradigm, moving to a regenerative way of thinking is not just how we work on the farm, but it's even how we research what happens on the farm. And that shift is, I mean, that's in a way a radical and very exciting invitation because it changes the whole science around you know, what we look to see, is this moving, is this working, is this going forward?
And that's where, you know, some ask, well, you know, why is General Mills investing in this space? Like, what's a food company's role? And I think this is a perfect example where, you know, because we've made a commitment, because we've had strong sustainability goals and strategies for some time now, we were able to bring someone like Steve on who can kind of fill some of the gap that exists with that a different approach to experimental design. I mean, it's not to say that it's not being done elsewhere, but this systems level research, sometimes it's really hard to fit that in with research priorities at existing institutions. So that's, I feel like, a place that we've kind of just like nestled into because of all those questions that Steve was just saying, like, how do we study this, this, and this, and this? That might be 10 different research projects at a university. We're trying to pull it all together into one to understand the kind of the higher level order outcomes of a systems approach and outcomes at a systems level.
Well, you mentioned investment there, so I'm going to ask one last question focused on investment, which is, if you had $100 million to invest into regenerative agriculture and sort of developing this overall system, what would you do with it? Where would you put the money?
You want me to go, Jay, or
Steve,
do you
want to go first?
I mean, I would probably do what we're doing now, which is you work in a particular place, and that place can get much bigger depending on how much money you have. But you try to figure out you try to understand that place, like its potential and constraints, and then you invest your money in the key areas that are going to produce the most regenerative effect. And, in some cases, infusions of cash don't produce that effect. It's really more about connecting the dots between resources that are already there. And so it's not always about how much money you have. I think it's more about sort of like what approach you're coming into this problem with, or this, this region with. And so, some of these gaps that we've identified with technical assistance and coaching to farmers, providing that mentorship, I think you could really, I would love to just blow that out so much more and figure out how we even build a pipeline of people that have this mentorship capacity, engaging with universities and, places where agronomists and other, coach types kind of emerge from. Let's invest in the capacity of those organizations to produce better mentors and coaches. So yeah, it's a really, I didn't answer that question very well.
No, that's
but,
good. You basically said, I think I'm doing a good job, and
yeah,
let's do more of it.
What we're doing already. Yeah.
do more of it. I think, something that Steve's really worked hard to do to bend all of our minds at General Mills is just like, we don't really understand the effectiveness of our approach yet. And so like to make sure that we're researching also some of the social science and some of the, do the programs actually work? Are they effective in changing mindset? And so I think it would take a pile of that money and make sure that we are auditing ourselves throughout the process. And so we can make sure that we have opportunities to adapt and adjust to make sure that we're really meeting the needs of that local context. And then using some of that money, like if in every major agricultural system getting down to like a watershed level or a county level, to understand like what are the suite of incentives that are best suited for the producers in the area to drive the most adoption. If we spend some time assessing that, then we know that all the investment coming after is informed, right? Because I think there is a lot of dollars out there to say like, hey, we just want more of these things, but I don't know that it's always rooted in an understanding of the local context for what is really needed. It's like what a lot of these companies and organizations believe is needed. So let's make sure that we understand how to build that holistic surround for that producer in that place, and so that when we have investment and opportunity to really ramp up and scale, it's the right type of investment and not all in technical assistance. If there's really good local technical assistance already, let's make sure that it's in like connecting producers one-on-one. Let's make sure that we blow out the financial support mechanisms or focus on policy at a state level. So I just don't think we know enough of that yet. And so if we had more money to do that assessment across the globe, really, in some of our key sourcing regions, then we feel a lot more confident about stepping in with much larger investments.
Let's hear some questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll get you off mute. We also had a few in the chat that we'll start with. But yeah, we'd really love to hear from anyone on this. I don't know if I can actually, I'm not going to read out loud that whole question. Steve and Jay, can you actually see that in the chat there? If you click on that, I'll give you may want to read the whole thing, but it's basically asking about challenges with a generational changeover, and farmers who in their late 60s, 70s, they may not have actual control over the land long term. So basically farmers are thinking like, it doesn't make sense for me to invest in transformative practices because I might not be there in 5 years. So yeah, what have you seen in terms of this rent and the generational change? What is that something you run into? How has that played out in your pilots?
Yeah, so there definitely is a generational shift happening, and we've seen it both ways. Where the older generation actually has now seen the light of regenerative ag, and they know that they don't have that many more cropping seasons to do it, and so they are more fired up than just about anybody because they don't have that much time to figure out how to do it and to pass something better off to that next generation. So that's actually one where we've seen the older farmer is trying to really inspire that next generation and hand something down better to them. But the other way, which I think this question is referring to, is like, what happens when it's the younger person that wants to do regenerative ag and they don't have the decision-making ability to do that? And that's something we see all the time. I don't think we have a great answer for it, but there is a bit of like, when we do prime the pump with the older generation, when we get them in the room at the soil health academies, or when we have them come to a field day, we make sure that the younger person that's really interested in this stuff, they bring the decision makers on their farm to these events just to plant that seed, so that when they do want to change something later on, they're coming from the same point of reference. And that's also where kind of these coaches, they're not just coaching on a particular field or with one particular person, they're coaching on the whole farm level, and they can help to mediate some of those conversations. Not that happens in all cases, but we've seen where, just having that older generation part of these conversations, they're much more willing and able to trust the younger generation when they want to go do something. So
yeah, I'll just add quickly 2 things. So non-operator landowners is a big opportunity. And so asking about like $100 million, what we do with some of that, I mean, I think it's just like education, awareness, resourcing of these folks that aren't connected to the farm anymore, but get to make decisions for who's renting the land and operating it. Like, if they just understood more about the possibility of regenerative ag and the long-term financial opportunity, I think that's something that we definitely need to address. TNC's done some really interesting work to study non-operator landowners in Iowa, and I think some of the other I states, just to understand who they are and how they make decisions. But like the landlord-tenant relationship, there's lots of opportunities to think about that differently to enable more of this to happen. And the second thing I'd share is just a bit of a story from our Kansas work where one of these producers attended Soil Health Academy with one of his sons, and there's 3 children that had no interest in coming back to the farm at all. But now with Regenerative Ag and Soil Health Academy, there's an interest from this younger generation in coming back to the farm because they see an opportunity to leave their own mark, do something differently, maybe revitalize what's there. And got some great feedback from our local partners in Kansas, was basically sharing this story and said, for this gentleman, that was the best outcome so far of being in this pilot for 6 months, is that one of his children now is interested in the farm. And so that's part of something we need to do, is just like get more of this out there, some of these stories, to help people understand, like, if there is more investment in kind of this mindset, we have to help people understand there's opportunity. It's coming back to the farm doesn't mean you have to do things the way that they've been done for the last several generations. You can take a different approach, and if you have a lot of broken ecosystem processes and degraded resources, you don't have to have those, right? There's an investment that you can go down and change what's there for you and what's left for future generations. But it's tough to get that point across.
There's some great questions coming in here. So from Devin, what are some of the current measures you've used to interpret success of the pilot?
So we're working right now on a program evaluation questionnaire, which gets a little bit after, like, we have a couple like learning objectives, like how, do you understand more now about how to implement regenerative ag, or understand more now about the principles than you did before? So kind of getting after just a little bit of that mindset. We want to start surveying farmers. We're working with a social scientist on that. But we've taken all of our baseline measurements so far. So, this is the 2nd year of the pilot in the Northern Plains. It's the 1st year of the pilot in Kansas. And so now we just have baseline measurements for things like soil health and insects and birds. And
so soil health is like, it's like, what exactly is that? You've got, so organic carbon, you have the full chemical analysis, you have biological analysis, just.
Yeah, so it's everything from water infiltration rates to soil structure. So looking at aggregate stability to meter deep soil carbon stocks. So really kind of we're doing a ton of work with like Colorado State and Yale and the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium on soil carbon research. So we're going really deep with soil carbon, literally and metaphorically. We're looking at the microbial community. So looking at, phospholipid fatty acid analysis to see like who is there in the soil. Is it bacteria, fungi, how much of each of these different kinds of organisms are living there? Things like nutrients and your standard kind of chemical tests as well, but really trying to take a holistic look at soil health.
Yeah, and that's those are going to take time to be able to say what is the baseline, what's changed. And so I think we do have some more like qualitative and quantitative measures that we can interpret success from. Like this year in the Northern Plains, we just inventoried like who's doing something for the first time and what are they doing. So we have a set of like 8 people are trying intercropping for the first time. 6 producers had livestock already, but they're going to manage them more intensively moving forward. Who's moving from a single species cover crop to a diverse species cover crop? And some of that probably would have happened just given the producer's own interest and their own momentum. But we got to believe that some of that is enabled by this coach and this support, not only from the coach, but the other farmers. So you just feel like you have a community to go down that experimentation path with. So we have some of that information to say like, these are the new things that are happening as part of these pilots, so that we have some interim kind of success metrics before we're able to point to how soil carbon change or what happened to biodiversity over the course of 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, there's another question here about biodiversity outcomes. So maybe, Steve, a little more about what does that look like, monitoring for biodiversity, and what do you think it'll look like 10 years, 10 years from now, 2030?
Yeah, so each farm has dedicated a study field, and we are looking at all the insects living in the soil, in the plant canopy, and flying around in the air through different techniques. So we're working with John Lundgren's group at Ecdysis Foundation to do that research. We're also simultaneously testing out these sensors that they shine infrared light. They're basically cameras. You can mount them on a tractor or just put them in the field. And using machine learning, they can tell what type of insect it's looking at. So we're trying to develop this technology where a farmer would be able to just drive a tractor through a field and passively know all of the different insects that are living in that field, what type they are. Are they a pest? Are they a predator? Really start to understand who's there. So some of these kind of emerging technologies we're working on. Acoustics for looking at bird calls and trying to detect who's there on the farm and what different types of activities encourage different birds.
With a focus on like functional biodiversity, right, that we talk about. So it's like not biodiversity just for biodiversity's sake, the so what. And for some, they don't need the so what. It's just like, oh, I like more plant species, more birds around, like, but that's not going to be every producer. A lot of producers are going to be like, what does this biodiversity get me? Does it help with pest predation? Does it help with pollination? What are the services that more biodiversity provides? And so that's what we're studying. That sounds like, Steve, you correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like that type of research is pretty novel, like to think about services and ecosystem services from more biodiversity on farm.
Yeah, so in addition to the biodiversity that we're measuring, we're also measuring services like pest predation, weed seed predation, pollination, these different services, so that once we can know all of the insects that are living there, we can relate that abundance and diversity information to these services that farmers care about. So that's sort of the long-term goal.
Yeah, residue decomposition is another one, and that's a challenge that a lot of no-till producers have. It's like getting rid of residue sometimes. So it's like, if you grew more diverse species of plants, would you have more diverse habitat? Would you attract more diversity of insects? Like what, or even with your soil-based insects, like can they provide a service in breaking down some of that residue and more quickly for you? So investing in those things provides a return, and that's what we want to demonstrate in some of these pilot regions.
So there's a question from a little ago that's, talking about kind of scaling and direct investment in farmers. They were saying, farmers may not have the time, the network, the ability to focus on doing regenerative ag. So there was, this wasn't so much a question as a comment. It seems like this is a great place for General Mills to be investing. I have a kind of question building off of that, which maybe goes a bit back to sourcing, which is also to the renting and land use, and like, if these changes are going to take time, and we're mostly talking row crops here, but I also think about this in terms of trees. I grow chestnuts and hazelnuts and things that take 5-10 years to be yielding. So is there ever any thought from the sourcing side of having longer term contracts, of having longer term relationships that could sort of, not necessarily just investing, but even saying, yeah, we'll have a commercial partnership that can help you, know that you have the stability to take on and do some of these approaches?
Yeah, I mean, so I think definitely in some of our challenger smaller brands, our natural and organic business, Annie's, Epic, Provisions, they're endeavoring into that space. They have already, where they're creating direct farm relationships, thinking about contracting differently to provide a greater level of like demand assurance. And I think there'll be places where we can explore that with some of our larger brands. Coming from sourcing, I'm intimately aware of some of the challenges that can create. So just understanding the trade-offs of providing maybe a more compelling story with more transparency, but also providing flexibility, because in a year like we've had with COVID, it's been a big impact, a good positive impact on General Mills business, because we have a lot more demand for our products. What happens when you only have contracted supply? Where do you go and get a regeneratively grown ingredient if you don't have it? So what does that do as you think about any kind of claims on websites or on packs? And so there's lots of things to think about, especially when you're working on buying, millions of bushels of wheat or oats, and how to strike that right balance of like providing another incentive for producers while also maintaining some sort of sourcing and supply chain flexibility, so that we can be successful. And if we're successful, we can continue to bring that demand to the producer. But if our supply chains fall apart, it really becomes not as sustainable of a business model for us. So we're looking at those opportunities. My sense is that there'll be more, but I think they'll be smaller to start out with until we unlock more investment from all actors and players in the industry.
Any last thoughts you want to leave us with, or things you're excited about coming up that we should pay attention to? Or what would you leave us with to end this discussion on advancing regeneration principles and outcomes?
I would just say, we're early on in our journey. If you talk to us 3 months from now and ask us the same questions, I bet we'd have different answers. And so just recognizing that this is a journey and we are on it as well. And we're going to be constantly learning and evolving. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and maybe just a plug for, not asked to do this, but I think just the regenerative thinking in the business context, I think is shaping how we think about our approach to these pilots a little bit differently. And so that's been a welcomed addition to our thinking, how we can regenerate our thinking. And that's kind of an invitation for everybody on the call today, is like, how might you regenerate your thinking to whatever projects you're working on?
Awesome. Yep. And so come see more of these conversations with thought leaders. Also, we have innovation working groups where you get a bit more of a taste of that regenerative business thinking. All that's on the website. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Steve. Great to have you. And we'll have you back here again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.